third session, and just for context, we have a 50-50% split here on consultants and reporting companies, which is good. So we have both the advisory side and, of course, the ones being mandated. This is the third session. We've already covered 2 sessions. One was on the readiness assessment. The other one was on governance, which we got fantastic feedback. This one, we're going deep dive to strategy, understanding this pillar, of course, answering any questions, and feel free to do Q&A as we go. Don't wait until the end because you might forget it, and also makes it for a very good, engaging webinar. About the series, like I said, 2 sessions done, 3 to go. This one is on the strategy. The next one will be in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that. And finally, we have a session with Alex just on our partner program on May 8th, how NetNata fits into an ecosystem of advisory, empowering those experts.
Yeah, if you're interested in learning a bit more about how you can bring or elevate your carbon accounting offering as a consultant or anyone just working in the sustainability space, we're going to be covering all of that and covering our partner program in quite detail. So sign up on the website, plenty of links, easy to find.
Perfect. And when it comes to, probably everyone on the call is aware we're doing and publishing a report very soon. We've interviewed a lot of experts, 50 companies on the readiness level, and we are doing a live event on May 21st at the Greenhouse. If you're in Sydney, we'd love to see you there. I think it's going to be fantastic. We'll try to get a panel on, but to walk through some of those learnings of this report that can help your company identify bottlenecks that others already uncovered, and on the advisory side, understand how you can better support these companies, not waste anyone's time, and make sure it's a very symbiotic relationship in getting this work done. So put that in your calendars. We'll send more comms afterwards, but we'd love to meet you in person and get a chance to chat. Any questions? You know how to use Zoom by now, but feel free to either make it anonymous or put it in the chat, and Alex will read through those and bring it to me to answering. Quick recap. I know that most of you, I recognize the names, have been on previous sessions, but for the ones who haven't, a quick recap of what's this all about. We know the group 1 to 3 companies, we know the mandate, we know the pillars, but it's important to understand some of the language. And one of the languages is people. We are doing this for people who are called primary users, and the company gets to define who those people are. Most often, because of the way that the legislation is written, those people are investors. So it's more on the finance side. This is climate-related risk and opportunities. All right. So one thing to think about as well as you go to this content, there's a time scale to this. There's short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and everything that you do in your disclosures should have those 3 phases in mind. The other thing, as you see here in the legislation, it's about that ability to borrow money, the cost to borrow and returning that capital. That's why it's very good to have that perspective of finance, even though we're mostly into the sustainability space, that this is alongside financial disclosures. On a quick recap, this is how it looks in the legislation, so I'm not making anything up. We spent a lot of hours going to legislation to make this content, but you can always go back to the source. It's a PDF, with 80 pages. You can just read through that in that language, but you will find everything that I say in here. It's also in the legislation. You can always reference back to that. One key thing to understand before we move on, NetNata and these webinars are focusing on the mandatory aspect of the legislation. There's a voluntary one that covers sustainability. We are covering the climate pillar, right? There's broader sustainability, and there's the climate, which is mandatory. It's a standalone, and that's the AASB S2, and that's what we're covering, all right? So don't get the 2 mixed up. If you have any questions on S1, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to assist you or point you in the right direction. One thing as well, there's all these things that we have to do, right? We're going to the 4 pillars, but not everything is equal in terms of assurance. And one thing to understand that the sessions that we've done on governance, right? That needs assurance to begin with. The strategy and risk and opportunities, which will be part of what we're doing now, also needs assurance. So you still need to disclose everything, but there's some extra work to do with your auditors that we can help and assist with on getting the right information and processes and audit packs ready for them. All right. Any questions on that? Alex, anything that I skipped in that
No,
quick?
I think this one thing we were talking about in the office, which it comes up so often. There's so many dates getting thrown around. There's so many different levels, phases. When are we going to see the first ever of these AASB S2 submissions happen? Like there's starting this year, starting that year, but when is it actually due for the first time?
So that Group 1 company, if you are on a calendar reporting year, you actually have to do a submission by March 2026, and the ones on a financial will have to do it by September. So those are the actual dates where things will be submitted and released. It was kind of 3 months after the reporting cycle ends. So with having all this talk, those are the actual physical dates where companies will have to hit submit and upload that information, right? So
Yeah.
that's March and September.
Yeah. The other question we had coming through here, which kind of goes to this report you're about to release, Afonso, is, has anyone defined what limited assurance is in this context?
They are working through it. It's not like no one has set exactly what it is. There is a new assurance legislation that's already been released, and we can read through that as well. That kind of defines what it should be. But the auditors are working in very close collaboration with companies. So, for example, every time we help a Group 1 company at the moment, we are very closely working with the assurance team to get the pre-assurance or get the full assurance right from the beginning on what those packs look like.
Yeah, I think it ties in nicely to this next section here. The conversations we're having is this is a very collaborative approach. We want to have our auditors speaking to the people who are doing this analysis. We don't want to just keep it in silos and then hope when we can just kind of submit it that it all goes through. It should be a conversation that you're starting as of now. If you're a Group 1 or Group 2 company and you've got an auditor already selected, make sure they're having that conversation with the people who are doing your reporting.
Awesome. Exactly. So now to the core content of the session. It's about strategy. Let's deep dive into it. The strategy, the what, the who, and the how. We have to identify what are the climate-related factors, in the world, in the economy. Who is responsible to identifying those and integrating those in how your company makes decisions, and what decisions or what plans those things are. This strategy is about building that resiliency and transparency that your company is ready for the next 25 years of existing in our economy and in an ever-changing world when it comes to climate. This is all about proving that, right? We have the governance. Now let's look at the strategy, and you will influence things from the metrics and from the risks that are going to show up in strategy, but it's about showing that plan. So the first thing that we want to do in that plan is walk you to how do you combine everything into what's called a transition plan, which is a big chunk of this section. And as you have marketing plans, you have social media plans, we have sales plans and strategy, the same thing, right? As your company do the other plans, you need to do your climate transition plan. It's now part of your core business. So why the need for this? You need to demonstrate that proactive climate action. And when I say climate action is from a business and finance perspective that you're ready, you understand. And you need to showcase and lay those targets, those actions, the deployment of capital to an economy that's going to move into low carbon, and it's also that can be resilience into a climate change. And the detail of this plan you can find in the appendix. But now we're going to walk through what a good plan is and then go to some paragraphs of the legislation that are most relevant that you need to prepare ahead of. What's in that plan and what's in this strategy pillar? There are 5 things. We have the business model and value chain. We have the climate risks and opportunities. We have the decision-making piece. We have the climate resilience, and we have the financial. It's important to understand that the financial piece kind of trickle downs to every other section, because you want to showcase in a quantitative and a qualitative way how these things that you are forecasting, identifying, preparing for, or changing your business model will actually ultimately impact your financial statements. Because as we talk about those people, those users, they're usually financial related. It's about loans, it's about ROIs, it's about banks. Okay? So as we look at these 5 things, not just one, there's 5 elements. We're going to look at what a good climate transition plan looks like. And these are the 7 things that are really good to have in mind as you go through the exercises. It needs to be clear objectives and targets. So you need to actually put dates, numbers, smart goals in a sense, and detail those milestones. You need to make these decisions or those goals with stakeholder engagement. They can't be done in a vacuum by yourself with desktop research. You have to involve internal people and external data sets to make these decisions. You need at the beginning to look at all the risks and opportunities that you think are applicable to your company, and then distill them down to the ones that are material, because you might identify a lot of them. You need to pick the ones that are going to be relevant. You need to, now it's the hard part, you need to actually resource and fund these initiatives. So in theory, you have to forecast and project how much money you would need to implement these strategies. So you want to showcase that, like allocation of dollars. And you need to be able to have monitoring and reporting. If this is going to go on for 25 years, this strategy, until 2050, how do you actually monitor if they're going to be being implemented correctly, the effectiveness of them, or changing them over time?
Yeah, and I think as well, it's really easy to put a negative lens on this whole operation, like, oh, what are the risks that are going to adversely affect our business? But it's also, we really encourage people going through this process already to, what are the positive opportunities? How can we access new capital through identifying these opportunities? How can we, improve tenant demand or improve employee engagement? So taking that positive lens is that there's so much to be gained out of this exercise. It's not just a, compliance box tick or identifying these negative risks.
100%. And like I said, it's that risk and opportunities are with a positive lens in there. And what it needs to be, what it shouldn't be, like I said, let's focus just on what it should not be. It shouldn't be a generic template, so you can't just copy someone else's and adapt it. You can look at your industry, you can look at competitors or peers or similarities. It can't be vague. You need to actually make these statements to begin. So that's where like the anti-greenwashing comes in. They need to be exact, and it to be done with like commitment. And they also need to account for not only the short term, but also that long term that understands how your business will exist in the next 25 years, because that's how long you're going to take to return that money or get an ROI and so forth. Okay, so really the big piece here is like not vague and not a generic template. Now we're going to go into the section, and hopefully we're on time and everyone is having a good time. Alex, any questions, anonymous or in the chat, just let me know. We're going to go now to the five pillars of the strategy pillar, and try to identify some of the paragraphs that are might going to be relevant to your organization. Okay, starting with the key objective as a whole of this section, you want to do the listing, right? This is the identifying and disclosure. So it's going to be that list or that table, and I'll show some examples of what are those physical and transition risk and opportunities, and it's about getting them listed in a place and the process of how you selected those. Okay, so like I said, what are those climate related risk and opportunities that could reasonably, that's why it's in orange, affect your business? Because there's many out there, there's many in the world. You need to look at your industry, what you sell, what you do, your people, your region, your assets, and then pick those. You have to consider the physical and the transition risk. So we have the extreme weather, hurricanes, floods, and then we have the transition, which would be regulatory changes, shifting your consumers, opportunities in buildings, and I'll give some examples. But you need to show both, and I'll show a table in a second of what that looks like. And also think about that global versus local. Where do you operate? If you're operating like at a local scale, what's happening in there? But what can be some longer term shifts in the global industry that might impact your industry? The same way that you look for business opportunities based on new technologies, new movements, new legislations, now it also adapts for climate. This is the one of the structure, and everything goes from here onwards. The other thing, like I said in the past, there is a time scale to all of this. Okay, so as you do these exercises, always look at defining your short-term, medium-term, and long-term horizons. And there's some defaults here you can use in those time frames, but it might be your 1 to 3 years, then your 10 years, and then your 25 years, and it finishes in your 2050 as an example. And you use that to map how those risks and opportunities look like over time. Quick snapshot: if you're building that short term, medium term, long term, it might look something like this. And you then might expand across your report what happens in the short term, what happens in the medium term, and what happens in the long term. And from a financial perspective, from how the climate changes, how the temperature changes, customer preferences, budget, support, and so forth. Right? So always these three columns in this matrix.
And do we have guidance yet, Afonso, in terms of how granular and how, it's so easy to get really lost in the weeds of this kind of identification of risk and outline of the risk, and like you said, budgets and forecasting. Do we have any idea as to the standard as how granular they want us to be?
The focus is more on the process than on the granularity, and a good guidance, even though you don't have examples. Sorry, you do have European examples. You can look at. There are overlaps in legislation, so you can look at published reports there and see how have done this in the past. One thing to also look at is risk has always existed, and there's risk committees and risk teams. That exercise has been done in parallel verticals in a sense. You can look at that granularity and what good enough is in there, and then try to adapt that to here. And ideally, when we work with you, we're looking at those examples of not only documenting the outcome, but the process to get there. And some standards, and I'll show you in a second what those scenarios look like in terms of temperature increase on the medium term, short term, and long term. So a good example as well to keep in mind is that wording of reasonable and supportable. It might be too expensive or too cumbersome, or you might have the skills or the talent to find everything that could potentially impact your company. You need to showcase a good effort without undue cost to it to find what these things are. That's why the process and the documentation are really important. So you can look at past events, previous climate related events happening in your region, so in Australia. You can look at the current conditions and what is happening today, and then you look at external data sets to do that future forecast based on data, but based also on your understanding of the industry. Okay, the important thing is you need to do what's reasonable and what puts you in a good position to do this. Again, like I said, I'm not making anything up. Paragraph 11 outlines that process, and you can then review that information. Any questions on that, Alex?
No questions coming up too much. I guess, would you say that what you just mentioned there, that the process, the working out essentially, would you say the working out is just as important, if not more important, than the actual answer, not only for this pillar, but for mandatory reporting requirements in general?
Yeah, because we are moving into a world of, before everything was kind of a black box and there was these statements going out, and with the assurance piece coming on board, and if you look at how financial auditing is being done, the same thing will happen. So it's always understanding the processes and the controls that were implemented to get to that outcome. And sustainability people weren't used to that, and now that decision making, that process is as relevant as the final output. There's what you see on the flashy reports, that's the output, but there's all the process that needs to be documented to ensure that that output is correct, and that's where the emphasis is as well.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to be getting started right now, not kind of leaving this to the last minute. We can't just put the output together. We need to be showing the process and the strategies all come from good good conditions, good processes.
Yeah, a good example that we said on the last sessions is show that you're upskilling your team, right? If you've been doing this for a while, it's very easy to show the process of upskilling your team in climate related matters, because you have evidence of a session every quarter where you've done a workshop on a material topic of climate. If you're living into the last minute, you're just trying to do promises that something was going to happen, and you're trying to show evidence that it will happen now every 3 months. So the more you can do it in business as usual at a lower cost, more embedded into your organization, it becomes way easier to then document that and showcase it to auditors. Moving on to the second part is that business model and value chain. Here, we're trying to understand how those risks and opportunities that you've listed in the past affect the business model and the value chain. And we look at those resources, operations, and partnerships. So we've highlighted a couple of paragraphs here. you've listed them, you've listed the risk and opportunities, and you've listed them for a reason, because most likely they're relevant, but also because they affect your business model, how you make money, and so forth. So here's where you start going into why did you pick them, and you might pick them because the scope of impact is significant, not only in the short term but in the long term, or just in the long term as an example. You also seen that there is, on the opportunity side, like Alex was saying, that the good part of the coin is what are the opportunities and why should you chase this opportunity. You might see that the transitioning to a green product or a low carbon economy, or a gap in the market to provide. Let's look at solar, right? Green buildings, solar going hand in hand. New changes in procurement of the government. You start seeing these synergies, and as a business leader, you start saying, okay, I'm going to chase this opportunity because it's relevant in the context of climate. Right? That's where this comes in on the opportunities. And then, of course, look at like external factors. What are your suppliers doing? What are your partners doing? Your customers and your investors, and what are they expecting based on past performance or things that you're hearing from them. The other thing as well is where in your business, right, in value chain, are most of these risks and opportunities concentrated. They might not overlap, so your risks might be on one side and opportunities in a different side. So let's say if you are a fashion business, your risks might be in your top two suppliers because they provide with 80% of your clothing range, as an example, and they might be at a risk because there's now more extreme weather events where the manufacturing is based that might impact your supply chain. You can't meet seasonal trends, etc. While the opportunities might be on producing or doing R&D on a new line of products made of plant-based material, hemp, and so forth. So one is suppliers, the other opportunity is on your R&D for a new sale or a new line of clothes. So there might not be an overlap. It can be, but it really depends. So look at hotspot identification. Look at that asset risk. If you have physical assets, how are they impacted by weather events, increased temperature, flooding, rain? In Australia, look at the Northern Rivers, Lismore, floods, Queensland, etc., fire hazards, etc. And then look at your sector. How can your sector be impacted in terms of imports, manufacturing, and so forth.
And do you think, Afonso, this business model aspect of the strategy component is going to really accelerate that knock-on effect we've been talking about in the market for a while now, how the biggest players are putting more and more pressure onto their value chain, and it's causing the everything from the SMEs to the companies who are in that kind of mid-tier market to really start to try and improve their own sustainability credentials to answer the pressure from Group 1, Group 2 companies?
Yeah, we're going to see that, and we're also going to see more collaboration, right? Because before it was just more, I'm going to look at the risk, and you might have supply chain engagement. You look at modern slavery. I just want to understand the risk in this value chain. And now you're going, we have to go from risk to a strategy, and that strategy might involve collaboration. So the ones who are pushing ahead with being more transparent, we're actually providing a solution to the reporting companies, would see them being prioritized in terms of strategy or procurement piece, because they can start ticking boxes of showcasing the change that they're doing in the allocation of purchasing, budget, investment, and so forth. So 100% more, not just on the contract side, but also on the strategy side. And this is the output, right? Now it's very raw, it's not clean out, but bring all this together, you're seeing a table. It can just be as simple as a table. Like I said, the process is important, where you've listed if it's a physical risk, transition risk, opportunity in one axis of this matrix. You're going to highlight the time horizon. So this is a physical risk in medium and long term, and the status is increasing, so it's becoming more of a risk over time. And here we identified, increased severity and frequency of extreme weather events. This is an example of a property company. We got it in the name, Ozprop, right? And you're saying, okay, likelihood of this, it impacts our commercial, residential, and industrial assets. It increases insurance costs. Might disrupt our tenants, how they behave in our assets, and actually might devaluate some assets if they're on, very risky zones. A house now in Lismore is worth differently because of the floods. Same thing in bushfire. Everyone has read the articles on insurance at the moment. So it gives those examples. And then you highlight how you might, and we'll go in this a bit later, mitigate or adapt those efforts. I'll send these to the slides, but just an example. If you look at the opportunities here, I'm gonna pass on the other risk. You see from a building side, there's opportunity of strong sustainability credentials. Green Star, neighbors rating in buildings. If you don't invest in that, on getting those ratings or preparing your assets, you might miss on a market opportunity. And here you highlight how you're going to adapt. So you're going to, as OSPROP, they're going to target high sustainability rating buildings on all new major developments. That's the cause and the consequence on how you capture that opportunity. So at the end of the day, all the legislation might be the output on a table that goes into detail. And of course, you have report notes, think about assurance, etc. But this could be one of the outputs. Any questions on that, Alex? Anything that I missed?
No, it's moving along nicely. I guess, half the audience here today are consultants. This area is where we can really see not only opportunity and a lot of insight into how we're going to be able to help these reporting companies, but also how it's going to affect the rest of the market. So I think it's really interesting from that perspective.
Yeah. And from the reporting company side, it's okay to be overwhelmed, but also understand that at the end of the day, we're all intelligent here. We can all go through this process. This is a lot of stakeholder management, a lot of communication. And when it comes to the hard data, you can lean on published data sets, you can lean on research, but the hard work is end up prioritizing and listing out of the 7, 10, 15, which 3 or 4 end up on your report. That's the hard part. Now we're looking at the decision making. It's the plans in place to respond to these factors and goes into that mitigation and adaptation efforts, right? This is now business as usual. How have you responded to these risks? You've identified them, you know what they are, and then you decide how you adjust. You might ignore them for the first few years. You might only come around and tackle them in the next 10 years. Not a priority. There was too many. I'm going to just focus on 1 and 2. This is where you describe those things, right? So highlights how you've addressed these issues, how you plan to meet those targets or adapt to those risks. The other thing as well is, if you picked something like chasing neighbors' ratings for your new assets, how are you resourcing that? Those buildings might cost more money, therefore you might have to change the allocation of your capital to be able to purchase those high neighbors rating buildings. That's how it overlaps in terms of how you have to showcase that you have the money for your capital expenditures, your training. In the example of the fashion industry, of that research and development for new lines that now might be more costly in terms of producing, a hem shirt versus something else. That's where this goes, and that's where you have to showcase. At the end of the day, it could be an output, of course, if there's enough process, where you can just go and highlight how much money you're going to deploy into energy development, your climate resilience fund. Think of a big company, how I'm going to be able to mitigate if something bad does happen in terms of weather events, and then how you're going to deploy that capital over time. So here you can see an example of 5 years, you can see an example of 10 years, and here you see an alignment of other things like Paris Agreement goals. You might have things like science-based targets and so forth. Right, we are mostly halfway. Hopefully you're enjoying the dense afternoon session and trying to get the most out of it. If you have a lot of questions, feel free to follow up. We spent a lot of hours understanding this and working with our clients. And I know this might be new for everyone, so feel free to then digest this, read through it, and then start asking questions on how this is relevant to your company.
Definitely. Any questions, please just shoot through. We've had some really good conversation in the chat so far. Some great insights from Kirsty. So please keep them coming. Any questions as well?
Awesome. And Alex, then when you want to get those, because I know that some questions are going anonymously. It happened in the last session. You can just surface those and say it back to me. Feel free to do so.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Awesome. So finally, your entity, how is it tracking the progress? If you have these things, what are the KPIs? This ties in with that governance piece. Who's in charge of checking if you're progressing in a strategy, in an initiative, and so forth. So that's the end of that pillar of the strategy section of the pillar. It combines a lot of things, has a bit of that decision making, of you've listed the risks, now you're showcasing how you are tackling those risks over time.
We just had an anonymous question here as well, Fonzo. So you mentioned earlier around having 2 to 3 strategic decisions or 2 to 3 aspects, and in that Auspop example, you have 2 to 3. Is there any guidance as to how many we need to include?
There's no guidance. There's not a set number of items. That's why that process is important. That ambiguity. You have to put the ones that you deem they are reasonable for your business, that you had enough effort and time to go and research and do. But there's no like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are good or bad.
Yep.
You might have 7 risks in only 1 opportunity. Of course, if I was an investor and if I saw that, it's like, well, have they tried hard enough to feel that they have opportunities in this market? Because if not, if over the 25 years there's only risks that they're trying to protect against, and the company can capture, on a new type of economy that's going to happen in the next 25 years, there might be for that. So take your time to build a balanced portfolio, but also be realistic of what is actually happening in your industry. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's about following a process that you've listed, things that are material, things that you see and know, the same way that your leadership is expecting from the normal business development. Now the same thing on the climate side, and how that influences the business.
And just another one here from Ryby, but is there any balance of disclosing business plans without giving away too much information that competitors may leverage?
There is a nuance there in the legislation of what is deemed enough and strategic or business secrets, and you can omit certain information on the final report. You still need to showcase that in the process, right? Same thing with your financial disclosures. Also understand that not everyone is a public company, and you still have to disclose that to when you submit your reports. Okay, so there is nuance, but because you're focusing on the process, some things can be left out on that final report, but it still needs to inform your users that you thought about it.
Okay, great.
Awesome. All right, so now looking at we've been through this. The financial position. This is one of the hardest part in that way, Rye, where we go into how much is enough on that qualitative and quantitative information on how climate factors influence your finances, right? How do you showcase to your businesses? At the end of the day, public companies already showcase financial information and strategy on annual reports. It will be on the same level of expectation that it happens on the climate side. The biggest challenge, of course, here will be how do you combine that, or do you have enough resources or time to do the modeling, on that financial quantitative side, not only the qualitative. A good example could be sales will be reduced over time in this sector because there'll be less appetite for non-renewable, non-electric vehicles. How much will that impact your company? Well, you will have to forecast that and do an estimation, maybe 15%, 10%, 20% over 10 years, and so forth.
And Afonso, is this forecasting, is that falling within the consultant sustainability responsibilities, or is that the forecasting goes back to the finance team's responsibilities?
Definitely. I mean, how we've seen sustainability, and if we look at the governance pillar session, where you see that sustainability committee or the board engaging with different executives, from the CFO to your CSO on getting this done, or your actional consultant, it's important to know that if you want to do any projections, your finance team, your business development team needs to be involved, because they call the shots, or they understand that part of the business. That's why that stakeholder engagement is really piece. It will be impossible for isolated sustainability person to do this quantitative information analysis. And as we go through that, like I said, how have these risks or in the future impact your financial position, right? For that reporting period, and also in the short term, medium term, and long term. Focusing a lot on there's the physical impacts. If there's this many floods, this many hurricanes, this many fires, how can that impact your business and across your supply chain? And also transition costs. If you want to go and capture a new opportunity, how much you need to invest to achieve that?
In terms of transition costs, I guess it's a nice segue into a question we've had here. Is there any insights into the overlap in the requirements between the AASB and people who would have completed the ISO 14001 to 2016 environmental management system? Can you put a lot of that work into a lot of the strategy we're discussing today, the processes that you've gone through?
I think there will definitely be benefits if you've done that process already on how, I think your governance piece you can adapt that and put that into climate because you've went through that process. You just have to make sure that how you do your risk, how you do your governance touches on, because from your ISO you haven't done financial modeling on short term, medium, and long term as an example. But I think on the ISO, I think your processes have already been locked in, which is great, and you can just add to those. And the same thing when you look at the governance and how you do certain things and who's responsible for what, your company will be experienced in doing those things and setting up that framework. That's the biggest benefit. It won't be new to you what's behind the scenes of this. It will be new content, but you already been through the motions of doing something similar. So like I
Great
said,
question.
yeah, go ahead.
I said it's a great question. Thanks, Wouter.
One point is that, short term, medium term, long term, like I said, not only how much, but when, at which point, right? Really key at which point, because what's happening now might not have any impact, but that there's going to be a transition period the next 10 years. At that point in time, we want to know. Now, same thing. Now we've looked at the performance, we've looked at the budgeting, and then we have the cash flows as well. So again, very heavy on the financial side. Supply chain disruptions, asset damage, new revenue streams, savings, all of this stuff documented in a qualitative and quantitative way.
I might have just lost you there, Afonso. No voice, yeah. Let's see if he's coming back on. Has everyone got me? Or is is it just Afonso we've lost? Okay, you got me. Okay. Sorry, Afonso, we just lost you there for about 10 seconds.
Okay, hello? Yep.
Yeah, we got you now. We got you now.
I'll just give an example of how you can do the qualitative aspect, like this market segment will increase sales, and obviously you'll be able to say that increases by 5% over the next 10 years, right? Or 50% in year one, and then the long range, it'll be negligible. That's what we want to say, and you can look at different markets, European market who's more advanced, other companies that have invested in the space, a lot of comparisons to try and do that modeling and draw those conclusions. Like I said, the quality of information, if possible, that quantitative piece, one isn't available and are difficult to identify in a separate way, or there's a high uncertainty of estimation here at the bottom, it might not be provided. You might lack the skills and resources to provide this information, but you will have to explain why this data is unavailable. When possible, you should disclose this in a combined way, right? Where you're putting the financial impact of multiple risks and opportunities into the same. Several things could drive the same financial outcome. Could be risk of floods plus fires. Together, we need to invest in relocating our assets. That's how it goes. All right. So really important. If you're not going to do quantitative analysis, you need to explain why. Unavailable, it's new, there's no public research, the current research is too expensive, other markets don't adapt to Australian physical risks, so forth. You need to give that reasoning, and that's going to be really core. And your auditor might be, that's not good enough, we don't believe you, go back to the drawing board.
And do you anticipate a lot of convergence as to not only this final financial position, but the broader mandatory reporting requirements outputs after the first iteration, when everyone kind of sees how everyone else has done it and we come together a bit, especially around these qualitative aspects? Or do you think that it will still remain quite individualistic?
I think there'll be more collaboration in being able to use, let's say if you're a group 2 company, you can look at group 1 companies, what they've done, and adapt if they're in the same industry, right? these people have looked at these risks and have selected those, therefore we might inherit some of those. And you can also now look at the European market to do like similar thing. But you'll see, like I said, the plan can't be templated. It needs to be yours. So you can just copycat. You need to go and do your own modeling, do your own materiality, and so forth. There could be some learnings, definitely, but you still need to, like I said, it can be a templated approach. One element as well that we, as we look into risks, physical risks have already, and we have the database of those. They exist. You can select them, but the hard part is how can we help you do that process of doing the right selection and documenting that. So it's not about understanding what they are. If we know what they are they adaptable or applicable to you, and why do you think so, and why did you choose those to report or tackle? We are on to the last one with 15 minutes to go. Fantastic work. Thanks, Alex.
No problem. Moving along nicely. Let's we'll have some time for a bit of open Q&A at the end as well. But again, please just shoot through any questions as they come along.
Yeah. And I know Alex loves the anonymous questions, but if you want to put in the chat for group learning, makes life easier. But if not, just send it to Alex and it will surface that information. Now comes to withstand those changes, those developments, and that uncertainty of what's involved in this part. This helps your stakeholders, those users, those people, those primary users of the report, understand how your company plan, the transition plan, responds in the long term. Right? It's more, again, you have already embedded this in the process, but what is your climate resilience at the reporting date? What have you done so far? That's why we believe it's important to start early, because at that point you can show evidence and then look into the future. So existing resources, right? Are there any? Have you deployed anything so far? The implications of the strategy, the uncertainty. If you're able to show over the 12 months we've done this, but there's uncertainty in these areas or this data or this market, it makes life way easier for your auditor and for your user. Lastly, adaptability. How flexible? Are you stuck on one track in one direction? It will be really hard to change if climate goes into one of the forecasts versus the other. How do you do that? Now, when and how did you carry that climate-related scenario analysis? That when is important. If you've done this 5 years ago, might be irrelevant. If this is your first time, that's good. It's early, but is it just that you've done it now, therefore it's impossible to have done the scenario analysis today, and there's no proof that you've been implementing it? That's where timing goes into effect. You can look at your scenario diversity. What are the range of things considered? You can look at international standards. Science-based targets, carbon disclosure project, other frameworks, to see how it aligns internationally, and that those time horizons have been selected properly. You can draw your assumptions here. We assume that Australia won't be impacted by transition to renewables. If you can show that evidence, you can state it and add it as a note. But you need to state those assumptions that led to the selection of your risks and also the scenario analysis.
Well, one question we had here, Afonso, is that do we need to do multiple climate scenarios, or can we just choose one pathway, for example, 1.5 or 2 degrees?
You have to show multiple. You don't have to show all. I think you have to show at least 2. And this is now, thanks for the question. This is like the example here, and this is from Ventia, very large organization in the infrastructure space, and we had a chance to go through their report here. Very well designed, a bit of ahead of the curve because of just like the capital deployment that they have to do. But this kind of puts things into, okay, we talk about these scenarios, etc. What is it? It's a short term, medium term, long term, and long term. But not only what we're seeing here is a future, right? It's to which temperature will planet's temperature increase, right? And depending on what you select, there's different physical impacts and risks that can impact your business, right? So if you go on to the 1.5 degree future where things go well with best case scenario, you might not have to protect so much your assets from climate hazards, because there won't be an increase drastically on floods or fires and so forth. But you might have to deploy more capital to support the transition, because people expect you to invest in the transition. That's how this simple snapshot works, where you're setting up and understand that these scenarios, you don't have to make them up, they exist, and you can pick these temperatures and what each scenario looks at a high level from the IPCC. Okay, so you don't have to make them up, they exist, you just have to select them.
And I think that's really nice to reflect the connectivity, interconnectivity of all of the different pillars of the strategy, this kind of circular puzzle you had, Afonso. How does our climate scenario, resilience aspect filter into our strategic decision making? How is it also impacting the other areas? So this is a really good example of a dual or multi-scenario evaluation. And it was actually really well timed with Jared's question of, are there any examples of businesses who have explored dual scenario evaluation? I'll just tack onto that, Afonso, as a question for you. This is obviously a great one from Ventia. Is there any other companies that you kind of would hold up their sustainability reports and plans to have already been doing a lot of what we've discussed in this webinar and the previous ones really well, that people can get a bit of inspiration from?
I think if I'll say the well, not well, but you look at things like any bank, any industry that has, it's high capital intensive, that it's very reliant on external investment, private equity, or loans from banks, etc., will have good climate scenarios, because you need to know how protected your money is, right? So that's where you want to look. If you look at infrastructure, if you look at logistics, you'd see those things. And if you look at finance as well, you'd see very good different scenarios. And finally, if you look at assurance, they'll have the most detailed ones in terms of the impact of climate on that. Again, it won't be relevant for everyone. Just know that. And we'll share some good reports. And again, not everything is comprehensive. It is important to understand the process that goes there. But I want to come back to this table, and you can be stable growing from here. We're just looking at that medium long term, but you can put the different scenarios alongside these on this matrix, where you look at this risk across the scenario where things go in the best case scenario all the way to the worst, right? Or in your 2 or 3 that you've picked, and you can see how you adapt differently or the impact in a different way. Okay, so we'll send some examples, but just think about that, of that output of the reader needs to understand that your company has thought about this, has forecasted the impacts, and has picked the right risks in a so going all the way to the end, just looking at tackling this, if you're just getting started, I recommend doing a readiness assessment, right? Just to know where you are. And secondly, looking at, hey, can I start mapping all the paragraphs for my company and doing yes, no, and potentially look into doing a gap analysis, where you look at where you are now, you have someone helping with that, and say, okay, what else needs to be done, and building that roadmap over time. Things that are default that you're going to have to do, your emissions measurements will have to be done. The governance might take time, that we covered on the first pillar, and then this part of strategy will combine everything together. And finally, again, thank you so much for everyone coming. Stick with Alex if you're looking at the partner program, but for everyone, companies and consultants, come and join us in Sydney if you can. Look at the report, because there was a lot of effort put into the companies providing that information and sharing it with us, and jumping on interviews and understanding what the biggest bottlenecks from organizations might help your board conversations, your leadership, getting the necessary budget to get this work underway. Alex,
Great. And will there be an online version of that event? The long AASB S2?
We'll look into setting it up. If we can't do also the live event on the day, we'll be at a later date. We will go to the report in a webinar. But the one we're trying to get the people there, of course, we'll release the report shortly after as well, straight to your inboxes. But it'll be great to chat with you in person.
Great. And then Ches has shared a link to the live event in the chat. We'll also send that out in the kind of follow-up email